They did not come at war. They did not come with fire, shouting, or the sound of steel. They came quietly, while the city slept, while doors stood unguarded, while people believed that morning would arrive exactly as it always had. By the time Paris understood what had happened, it was already too late to speak. An entire order, powerful, visible, unquestioned the day before, was gone in a single night. Not defeated, not warned, simply removed. This is not the story of a battle. This is the story of how silence can be more effective than violence. How a city can witness history without realizing it is happening. And how one night, carried out without noise, can last for decades. Listen carefully, because nothing in this story announces itself until it is finished. Part 1. The World That Does Not Know. 1. Paris at Dusk. Paris settled into evening without hesitation. Autumn had already taken hold of the city, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty that comes when change has been allowed to arrive slowly. The air cooled earlier than it had weeks before, and the light withdrew with less reluctance, leaving the streets to darken in familiar stages. There was nothing abrupt in the transition from day to night. Paris knew this rhythm well. Shops began to close at the expected hour. Wooden shutters were drawn in practiced motions, hands moving without thought, guided by repetition rather than attention. Merchants counted coins by fading light, not rushing, not lingering. The business of the day concluded as it always had, with no sense that anything required haste or delay. Along the narrower streets, the sound of footsteps softened. People returned to their homes carrying baskets now lighter than they had been in the morning. Conversations dwindled naturally, not because they had ended, but because the night did not encourage them to continue. The city did not fall silent. It merely lowered its voice. The Seine reflected the last fragments of daylight. Its surface carried distorted images of bridges and lamps, bending them gently as the water passed beneath. Boats lay moored along the banks, secured for the night. No unusual movement disturbed the river. Nothing traveled faster than expected. Nothing lingered longer than it should have. From the towers and churches, bells marked the hour. They did not ring in warning or celebration. They rang because it was time. Their sound moved across rooftops and courtyards, touching the city evenly, reminding everyone of where they were within the shared order of the day. These bells had rung before. They would ring again. There was comfort in that continuity. Monks returned to their houses. Prayers were said at the proper times. Candles lit where candles had always been lit. The rhythm of devotion did not falter. There was no interruption in ritual, no sense that the night required anything beyond what had already been given to countless nights before it. Soldiers stood at their posts. Their presence did not increase. Their posture did not change. they were not alert in any way that distinguished this evening from others. Authority remained visible, but not emphatic. It did not announce itself because it had no need to. The Templars were still part of the city then. They walked openly. Their houses stood undisturbed. Their insignia drew no special attention. They were neither celebrated nor questioned. They existed within Paris as they had for years, known, familiar, unremarkable in their permanence. No one watched them more closely than usual. No one avoided them. No one imagined that this evening marked the end of their place in the city. Paris moved toward night, believing itself intact. The streets, the bells, the shutters, the river, all suggested continuity. The city trusted what it saw because it had always been safe to do so. Nothing in the dusk contradicted that trust, and so the evening passed without resistance, without warning, without knowledge of what had already been decided elsewhere, and would soon begin to move through the streets under cover of the same calm that now settled over the city. 2. Bells, hours, and habit. Time in Paris did not belong to the people who lived within it. It belonged to the bells. They governed the day with a precision that no written schedule could match. From towers and churches, their sound divided the hours cleanly, assigning each portion of the day its proper weight. Work began and ended according to their call. Prayer followed their rhythm. Rest came when they permitted it. No one questioned this order. The bells did not need to explain themselves. Their authority had been accepted long before any living memory could recall its beginning. To hear them was not to receive information, but confirmation that time was proceeding as it should. That evening, they rang as expected. The sound moved across the city in slow waves, passing over rooftops, slipping down narrow streets, reaching into courtyards where lamps were already being lit. Each tone was familiar enough to be absorbed without thought. No one paused to count them. No one wondered if they rang too early or too late. In monasteries and houses of prayer, the bells aligned life with devotion. Monks rose, knelt, and returned to silence according to hours fixed long before this night. Candles were trimmed, psalms were recited. The repetition itself carried meaning, not urgency, not anticipation, only continuity. Faith practiced this way did not prepare for disruption. It reinforced stability. Beyond the walls of the monasteries, the city followed its own version of the same pattern. Families gathered indoors at customary times. Meals were taken without delay. Doors were barred not out of fear, but habit. The sequence of evening gestures, washing, eating, extinguishing lamps, unfolded in its usual order. Habit was Paris's great strength. It allowed the city to function smoothly, predictably, without constant vigilance. People knew where they were meant to be at each hour, and the city rewarded that knowledge with a sense of belonging. To live within Paris was to be synchronized with it. That synchronization, however, came at a cost. Habit dulled attention. When actions repeat without consequence, they no longer invite scrutiny. The bells rang, therefore the world was in order. The hours passed, therefore nothing required intervention. No one asked what moved between the bells. No one wondered whether the hours themselves might be used as cover rather than structure. As the final bells of the evening faded into the cooling air, Paris accepted the night without resistance. The city aligned itself once more with a rhythm it trusted completely, unaware that this same rhythm was being used to ensure that nothing out of the ordinary would be noticed until it was finished. The bells had done their work. They had marked the time, and in doing so, they had helped conceal what was already moving toward its appointed hour. 3. Nothing suggests an emergency. Nothing in the city signaled that attention was required. There were no raised voices, no hurried steps, no sudden gathering of people in places where they did not usually gather. Paris did not tense. It did not pause. It continued forward along the lines it had always followed, guided by routine rather than instinct. If there had been an emergency, it would have announced itself. The city was accustomed to recognizing disruption. Fire, unrest, public decree. These things carried sound and motion. They altered the behavior of streets and people alike. On this evening, none of those signs appeared. The air remained calm. Movement remained measured. Those who might have noticed change did not. Guards at their posts saw nothing unusual to report. The number of men on the streets did not increase. The flow of people thinned at the expected hour. Even the late travelers moved with familiar purpose, heading home or toward places that welcomed them after dark. In the homes of officials, there was no gathering. No hurried consultations took place in chambers lit long past their usual time. No servants were summoned in unusual numbers. The machinery of governance, when observed from the outside, appeared idle, resting as it often did in the hours between evening and morning. This appearance was not accidental. The absence of visible urgency was itself a condition that had been carefully preserved. Whatever required action had been arranged to avoid the signs by which the city recognized danger. Paris had learned to respond to alarms, not to quiet. Those who went to bed that night did so with untroubled minds. They expected to wake to the same city they had left behind in sleep. Their confidence rested not on information, but on consistency. Each evening that resembled the one before, it reinforced the belief that nothing could change without warning. The Templars themselves sensed nothing. Their routines were unchanged. Their houses followed the same order as always. Evening prayers were said, accounts were closed, doors were secured for the night in the manner that had protected them for years. No one sent a messenger. No one sought clarification. No one prepared a defense. Paris did not lack the capacity for alarm. It simply had not been given reason to use it. The city trusted that if something required attention, it would make itself known. That trust was misplaced. While Paris dismissed the night as ordinary, the absence of emergency became its most dangerous feature. The calm that reassured the city also prevented it from seeing what was already unfolding beyond its awareness. Nothing suggested that this evening differed from any other, and that was precisely what allowed it to succeed. 4. Messengers on familiar roads. The messengers did not move with urgency. They had no need to. The roads they traveled were already accustomed to bearing authority quietly from one place to another. Paris was a city of correspondence, long before it was a city of spectacle. Decisions were carried through its streets daily, wrapped in paper and wax, their importance hidden by their familiarity. That evening, the messengers followed paths they knew well. They did not announce themselves. They did not travel in groups. Each moved alone or with one companion, keeping to routes that avoided the busiest crossings not out of caution, but efficiency. These roads had served the crown before. They would serve it again. Those who saw them paid little attention. A man walking with purpose after dark did not attract notice. Purpose in Paris explained itself. It required no introduction, no justification. The city had learned to accept that not every movement was meant to be understood by those who witnessed it. The messengers carried small packets. Each was sealed. Each bore markings that identified it as royal without revealing its content. The wax was pressed deeply, deliberately, as though to discourage curiosity, even from those authorized to break it. These were not messages meant to be discussed along the way. Doors opened briefly to receive them. Hands extended from within took the packet and withdrew. No words were exchanged beyond acknowledgement. The messengers did not wait. Their task ended the moment the seal changed possession. In several places, the packets were set aside without being opened. They rested on tables or desks, close enough to be seen, far enough to resist impulse. Those who received them understood that the timing of their contents mattered as much as the contents themselves. To open them early would not alter what had been decided. It would only burden the hours that remained. The messengers continued on. Their routes intersected only by design, never by chance. The Crown's instructions had been precise. Distribution mattered. Alignment mattered. The night was not to be interrupted by confusion or delay. Paris noticed nothing. The city absorbed these movements as it absorbed all others that did not disrupt its habits. Messengers passed beneath windows already darkened for the night. Their footsteps blended with those of watchmen and late travelers. No one followed them. No one wondered why so many were abroad at the same hour. The familiarity of the roads concealed the purpose they served. Authority moved as it always had, cloaked in routine. The messengers did not create disorder. They relied on the city's trust that familiar paths led only to familiar ends. By the time the last packet had been delivered, the streets had grown quiet. Those who now held the sealed orders understood what that meant. The city had reached the point in the evening when attention naturally withdrew. What followed would unfold beneath that withdrawal, shielded by the same normalcy that had carried the messengers to their destinations. The roads had done their work. They had carried decisions without revealing them. And Paris, trusting those roads, remained unaware that the night had already been set in motion. Savi, sealed orders. And the orders existed before they were read. This was their defining feature. They did not come into being at the moment the seal was broken, but much earlier, when ink had been laid upon parchment, when authority had pressed its mark into warm wax, when a decision had been concluded beyond appeal. Those who received the packets understood this immediately. They recognized the weight of a sealed order, not its physical weight, which was slight, but the weight of finality it carried. Such orders were not requests. They did not invite interpretation. They did not depend on circumstance. They waited only for the correct hour. In rooms lit by a single lamp or low fire, the packets rested untouched. Some lay on tables beside account books and writing tools. Others were placed carefully inside satchels, removed from sight but not from thought. Men went about small, ordinary tasks, straightening papers, extinguishing candles, all the while aware of what lay nearby, waiting. But no one opened them. This restraint was not imposed. It was understood. To break the seal too early would have been an act of impatience, and impatience had no place in matters of this kind. The orders would reveal themselves when they were meant to, and not before. The wax seals remained intact. Their surfaces were smooth, uncracked, bearing the clear imprint of authority. They had been pressed firmly, as if to resist not only tampering, but hesitation. Even unbroken, they communicated intent. They told those who saw them that the matter they contained was settled. This knowledge changed the hours that followed. Time, which had earlier flowed unnoticed, now acquired weight. Each passing moment brought the city closer to an action that could not be delayed or undone. Yet nothing outward marked this approach. The streets remained calm. The bells continued to ring at their appointed times. Those who held the orders waited. Some stood by windows and watched the city darken further, their thoughts occupied not by doubt, but by sequence. Others sat in silence, counting the remaining hours without moving their lips. The decision had been made elsewhere. Their role was to ensure it unfolded precisely. Paris, meanwhile, continued in ignorance. The city did not know that within its walls, sealed orders lay ready to be opened simultaneously, their contents aligned to the same moment. It did not know that the night had been measured carefully, divided into usable portions, each chosen for what it concealed. When the time came, the seals would be broken. Not dramatically, not ceremoniously, simply as part of a process already in motion. The act of opening would not create authority. It would only release it. For now, the seals held. They marked the boundary between decision and action, between what had been resolved and what had yet to be revealed. Paris slept beneath that boundary, unaware that the night had already been claimed. And with that, I reached its quiet conclusion. The city believed the evening had ended as all others had. In truth, it had only prepared the way. Part 2. The Night That Moves. 6. Movement without sound. The movement began without signal. There was no bell to announce it. No command shouted across courtyards or streets. The city offered no marker for the moment when decision became action. Instead, the night simply continued, and within that continuation, men began to move. They left their places quietly. Doors opened and closed without emphasis. Cloaks were drawn close, not to conceal identity, but to blend into the cold that had settled over the streets. No uniforms distinguished them. No banners marked their purpose. They moved as men often did after dark in Paris, with familiarity, with direction, without explanation. This was deliberate. Sound attracts attention. Attention invites interpretation. Interpretation creates resistance. The orders had accounted for this. What was required now was not speed, but invisibility. The men did not gather. There were no points of assembly, no moments where movement could be observed as something collective. Each man departed alone, or with one companion, spacing themselves across the city so that no single street bore the weight of what was unfolding. Paris absorbed this easily. The night watch noticed nothing worth recording. A figure passing through a side street was not unusual. A pair of footsteps moving steadily toward the river or away from it required no comment. Authority, when it does not announce itself, often goes unquestioned. The men followed routes they knew. These were not improvised paths, but familiar ones. The shortest ways between known points, the streets that curved away from open squares, the passages where sound was swallowed by stone. The city itself provided the cover, offering shadow where it always had. No one hurried. Haste would have betrayed intent. The pace was measured, consistent, indistinguishable from routine travel. Each man understood his timing precisely. They did not need to look to one another for confirmation. The sealed orders had aligned their movements long before this hour arrived. In some places, they paused, not from uncertainty, but from precision. They waited in doorways, beneath arches, in the shelter of walls where light thinned and attention weakened. These pauses were short, calculated to ensure alignment rather than delay. What mattered was simultaneity. The movement had to unfold everywhere at once, not sequentially. A door opened too early might have alerted another house. A delay too long might have allowed questions to form. The night required balance, enough motion to act, enough stillness to conceal. Paris remained unaware. Windows stayed closed. Lamps were extinguished one by one as households surrendered to sleep. The city's trust in its own rhythm shielded it from recognizing deviation within that rhythm. The movement continued beneath this trust. Men approached doors that had not yet realized they were being approached. Authority advanced without announcing itself, relying on the night to do what force would only complicate. This was the moment when the night truly began to move. Not loudly, not visibly, but with intent that did not require acknowledgement to be effective. 7. Doors that do not expect a knock. The doors were not guarded. They had no reason to be. These were not the doors of conspirators or fugitives. They belonged to houses that had stood openly for years, sometimes generations, their purpose known, their occupants accounted for within the city's accepted order. No one inside them expected secrecy to be required. The knock came softly. It was not the sound of urgency, nor of force. It carried no violence in it. It was measured, controlled, designed to travel no farther than the threshold it addressed. The kind of knock that requests attention rather than demands it. Inside, the response was habitual. Footsteps approached. A lamp was adjusted. The door was opened to the extent required to see who stood outside. This sequence had played out countless times before. Visits from merchants, messengers, officials. There was nothing in it that suggested danger. Those who stood beyond the doors did not rush forward. They announced themselves calmly, naming authority without emphasis. Their voices were low, even, trained to avoid drawing attention from neighboring houses. The words they spoke were formal, precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding, but also no invitation for discussion. The effect was immediate and quiet. Confusion, not fear. Those inside listened carefully, weighing what they heard against what they believed they understood of the world. Royal authority was not something to be challenged reflexively. If it had come here, it must have had reason. The absence of accusation made that assumption easier to accept. Doors opened wider, not out of trust, but compliance. The difference was subtle and important. Trust would have invited a conversation. Compliance required only acknowledgement. In some houses, brothers were asked to gather, not hurriedly, not under threat, simply instructed to prepare to leave, to bring what was necessary, to follow without resistance. The tone suggested procedure rather than punishment. This illusion mattered. It allowed the moment to proceed without rupture. There were questions. They did not last long. Each was met with the same response. There would be time later. The phrase was delivered without malice, almost kindly, as though delay were a courtesy rather than a denial. Those who heard it accepted it, believing that explanation still existed somewhere ahead. The night outside remained unchanged. No neighbors appeared at windows. No doors opened nearby. The sound of movement was contained, absorbed by stone and distance. Paris continued to sleep, protected by its own unwillingness to look closely at what did not announce itself. As each door closed again, it did so gently. There was no finality in the sound, no signal that it would not open in the same way again. And yet, something essential had shifted. A threshold had been crossed, not by force, but by assumption. The assumption that authority, once named, must be legitimate. Door by door, the pattern repeated. Houses that had never expected to refuse entry did not refuse it now. They had not been trained to do so. Their strength had always lain elsewhere, in order, in rule, in belonging to a system that promised protection through obedience. That promise, still intact in their minds, guided them into the street. And the night, having gained access without resistance, continued on its path. 8. Brothers who are not allowed to speak. Silence was not requested. It was imposed. Once authority crossed the threshold, the rules of the night changed subtly but completely. The brothers were no longer addressed as members of an order, nor as individuals with standing. They were addressed as subjects of a process that did not require their voices to function. They were told to remain silent. The instruction was delivered calmly, without threat or explanation. It was presented as procedure, not punishment. Speech, they were assured, would come later. For now, words were unnecessary. Some began to speak instinctively, not to resist, but to orient themselves, to confirm what was happening, to identify who stood before them, to understand whether this moment belonged to error or intent. Their attempts were brief. A raised hand, a quiet interruption, a repeated instruction to remain silent brought each effort to an end. No argument followed. The brothers had lived within rules their entire lives. They recognized the weight of instruction even when it contradicted expectation. To speak against authority without clarity would have been disorder, and disorder had never been their way. What was taken from them was not only speech, but connection. They were not permitted to address one another. No final exchanges were allowed. No whispered confirmations. No passing of information that might have preserved a sense of unity. Each man was isolated within his own compliance, his awareness confined to what he could see directly in front of him. This isolation was deliberate. Brotherhood depends on voice, on shared words, shared prayer, shared rule spoken aloud. By removing speech, authority did not merely prevent resistance. It dismantled the structure that might have supported it. In corridors and courtyards, movement replaced conversation. Footsteps echoed softly where voices would normally have sounded. The absence of words amplified every other sensation. The scrape of boots on stone, the faint rustle of cloth, the controlled breathing of men who understood that silence was now expected of them. Some carried questions inward. They did not disappear. They accumulated. Each unanswered thought pressed more heavily in the absence of speech, forming a private burden that could not be shared or resolved. This internalization weakened what collective identity remained. Outside, the city heard nothing. No raised voices carried into the streets. No appeals disturbed the night. Silence performed its function perfectly. It left nothing behind that could be recognized as injustice in progress. The brothers were led away without having spoken a single word in their defense. Not because they had none, but because the night had been designed to ensure that defense would not be heard until it no longer mattered. By the time the last of them passed beyond their familiar walls, silence had done its work. The order still existed in name, but its voice, the thing that had bound it together, had been removed. And the night moved on, carrying that silence with it. 9. Arrests without resistance. Resistance did not appear where many later expected to find it. There were no sudden struggles, no raised arms, no attempts to flee into the narrow streets. The brothers did not test the limits of what was being done to them. They did not force the night to reveal its violence. Instead, they moved as they had been instructed, guided by discipline rather than fear. This absence of resistance would later be misunderstood. Some would claim it proved guilt. Others would say it showed weakness. Those who were present understood something different. The brothers did not resist because resistance did not yet seem necessary. What was happening still carried the shape of procedure, not condemnation. They believed this moment would pass. Authority had come before in similar forms, to request testimony, to summon witnesses, to inspect records. These actions had always resolved themselves through explanation and order. The brothers trusted that this, too, would find its place within the same structure. That trust restrained them. When asked to step forward, they did so. When directed to surrender personal items, they complied without protest. Rings were removed, small tokens placed carefully into waiting hands, letters folded and relinquished with visible reluctance, but no defiance. Each gesture followed the logic of cooperation, not submission. The officers did not hurry them. There was no need. The absence of resistance allowed the night to proceed at a measured pace. Each arrest unfolded cleanly, without interruption, without spectacle. This efficiency disguised the severity of what was taking place. The brothers were separated deliberately, never led away in numbers large enough to form a group, never allowed to walk together long enough to exchange meaning through proximity. Each man was made singular within the process, his experience isolated from those of his fellows. This isolation reduced urgency. A man alone is less likely to believe that something collective has occurred. Without visible scale, the event remains personal, containable, temporary. The night relied on this misjudgment. In several cases, the brothers were told they would be questioned and returned. The words were not promises, but they sounded enough like them to be believed. Nothing in the manner of the arrests contradicted this expectation. There were no chains, no raised voices, no signs of punishment. The city, had it been watching, would have seen nothing alarming. Men were escorted through streets as others had been many times before. Authority conducted itself calmly. Order appeared intact. The absence of resistance preserved the illusion that the city's moral structure remained unbroken. Inside the brothers, however, something began to shift. As the distance from their houses increased, as familiar streets passed without acknowledgement, doubt replaced expectation. The silence imposed earlier now amplified uncertainty. Without speech, without shared understanding, each man confronted the growing realization alone. Still, none resisted. The moment for resistance, they believed, had not yet arrived. By the time it did, the night would already be over. 10. Monasteries without light. No, the light went out without announcement. Not all at once, and not everywhere in the same moment, but with a quiet consistency that suggested intention rather than coincidence. In the houses of the order, candles that had burned steadily through countless nights were extinguished and not relit. Lamps were left where they stood, their oil untouched, their wicks untrimmed. Darkness took the rooms back without resistance. This absence of light was not accidental. In monasteries and commanderies, illumination was never merely practical. It marked presence. It signaled prayer, study, vigilance. Light indicated that the structure of the order was intact, that its rhythms continued even through the night. To remove it was to interrupt those rhythms without explanation. Courtyards lay in shadow. Where figures had once crossed in pairs or groups, there was now only empty space. The stone held the day's warmth briefly, then cooled. Doors that had opened hours earlier did not open again. Windows remained dark, offering no indication of life within. Chapels stood unlit. Altars were left as they had been prepared for the evening offices. Candles remained unburned. The air held the faint trace of incense from prayers that would not be completed. Silence filled the space where voices should have risen in unison. No bells rang inside these walls. The internal markers of time, the small sounds that guided monastic life, were absent. Without them, the night inside the commanderies lost its structure. Hours passed without acknowledgement. The order's internal sense of continuity dissolved into an undifferentiated darkness. Outside, Paris did not notice. The city was accustomed to darkened religious houses at night. Nothing in the absence of light suggested that those within had been removed rather than retired. Darkness, in this case, protected the truth rather than revealed it. This concealment mattered. Had the monasteries glowed with unexpected activity, questions might have formed. Had voices carried into the streets, attention might have followed. Instead, the commanderies blended into the city's nighttime silhouette, indistinguishable from any other closed building. the order disappeared quietly. Not erased, not destroyed, but rendered inactive. Its structures remained. Its walls stood. Its name was still known. Yet without light, without voice, without movement, it ceased to function as a living presence within the city. By the time dawn approached, entire sections of Paris contained these darkened spaces. Places that had once anchored neighborhoods now offered nothing to the eye. Their stillness was deeper than sleep. It was the stillness of interruption. The night had accomplished this without force. It had removed the order not by breaking its walls, but by extinguishing what animated them. Darkness completed what silence had begun. And with the commanderies unlit, the city entered the final hours before realization, unaware that an institution had been switched off while it slept. Part 3. The city that feels but does not know. 11. The city does not sleep. Paris did not sleep as it usually did. There was no single moment of waking, no sudden disturbance that forced the city into awareness. Instead, rest became uneven. Sleep loosened its hold without releasing anyone fully. People turned in their beds, stirred, opened their eyes briefly, then closed them again without understanding why. The night had changed its texture. It pressed more heavily against walls and windows, as though the air itself had grown denser. Sounds that would normally pass unnoticed, a step in a distant alley, the shift of wood in a cooling house, seemed closer than they should have been. Not louder, but nearer, as if distance had shortened. Some rose and stood at their windows. They did not look for anything in particular. They simply looked. The streets below appeared unchanged. Lamps burned where they always burned. Shadows lay where they always lay. Nothing confirmed the unease that had interrupted rest. Others woke with the sensation of having been called. No sound accompanied it. No name was spoken. The feeling passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind only a mild disquiet that could not be explained. Many lay still afterward, unwilling to move, yet unable to return fully to sleep. The city breathed differently. This was not a matter of noise or movement, but rhythm. The familiar cadence of the night, the long pauses, the deep silences, had been altered subtly. Something was missing, though no one could yet say what it was. In certain quarters, streets felt emptier than they should have. Not visibly so, but intuitively. A house that usually emitted a faint glow remained dark. A doorway that often admitted late movement stayed closed. These absences did not register as facts. They registered as sensations, easily dismissed and quickly forgotten. Paris did not yet think. It sensed. This distinction mattered. Thought requires information. Sensation does not. The city at this hour existed entirely within the latter. It felt a shift without possessing the language to describe it. Those who woke and remained awake did not speak. They did not rouse others. They did not step into the streets. The unease was not sharp enough to justify action. It hovered just below urgency, convincing each person that whatever was wrong would resolve itself by morning. The night allowed this belief to persist. It offered no confirmation, no interruption, no sign that demanded interpretation. Paris remained in the space between rest and awareness, its attention dulled by the expectation that nights, however uncomfortable, always end. This one had not yet revealed why it felt different, but the city was no longer fully asleep, and that, more than silence or darkness, marked the beginning of understanding. 12. Whispers without rumors. The first whispers did not carry information. They carried uncertainty. They moved quietly between rooms where people had not fully returned to sleep, passing from one low voice to another without forming into anything that could be named. These were not rumors. Rumors require content. What circulated now was only the sense that something had shifted beyond individual experience. A woman leaned toward her husband and spoke a few words meant only for him. He listened, nodded once, and said nothing in return. Neither had anything concrete to share. The exchange served no purpose beyond confirming that unease was not singular, that it existed elsewhere, unspoken but present. In other houses, similar moments occurred. A servant paused in a corridor longer than necessary, listening for sounds that did not arrive. A guard shifted his stance, then returned to stillness without comment. A monk woke and sat upright in his cell, his thoughts unsettled by the absence of the rhythms that normally structured the night. No names were spoken, no accusations formed. There was nothing yet to accuse. Without evidence, language faltered. People sensed that words, if spoken too soon, might prove foolish or premature. It was safer to keep them vague, to let meaning gather slowly rather than force it into shape. The whispers stayed close. They did not travel far. They did not move from house to house or street to street. Each remained contained within small circles, dying out as quickly as it arose. The city did not yet possess the momentum required for collective understanding. This containment was crucial. Had a single clear rumor emerged, a specific arrest, a named target, it might have spread. It might have drawn people into the streets. Instead, the night offered only fragments, impressions without context, sensations without explanation. Paris hesitated. It lingered at the edge of recognition without crossing into it. The whispers acknowledged that something was wrong, but not what. They reassured and unsettled at the same time, allowing people to believe that the disturbance was internal rather than external. In some quarters, people told themselves that the unease belonged to the season. Autumn brought shorter days, heavier air. Sleep often grew restless as the year turned inward. There was comfort in attributing the feeling to something familiar and cyclical rather than sudden and irreversible. The whispers adapted to this explanation easily. They softened, lost urgency, became little more than murmured acknowledgments of discomfort. By refusing to solidify, they prevented themselves from becoming dangerous. This was how the night protected itself. By denying the city the clarity required for response, it ensured that awareness remained diffuse. Each whisper confirmed the existence of unease, but none provided a path forward. Paris remained suspended between knowing and not knowing. The city spoke softly to itself, without conclusion, without direction. And in that softness, the night continued to hold its advantage. 13. Fear without explanation. Fear arrived without a shape. It did not announce itself through danger or threat, nor did it gather around a single cause. It settled instead as a condition, a quiet pressure that did not point toward any object and therefore could not be avoided. People felt it before they understood it, a tightening in the chest without reason, a reluctance to move through familiar rooms, a sense that something irreversible had already occurred, even if no evidence could yet be named. This fear did not demand action, it discouraged it. Those who tried to examine the feeling found nothing to hold. The streets outside remained unchanged. No crowds formed. No officials appeared to explain or reassure. The absence of explanation deepened the unease. Without language, fear grew inward, becoming personal rather than shared. Parents checked on sleeping children more than once, not because of sound, but because silence had become unfamiliar. They listened for breathing, for movement, for any sign that the night still behaved as nights should. When they found none, they returned to their beds without relief. In the houses nearest the commanderies, fear was sharper. People sensed absence without yet identifying it. A usual light was missing. A door remained closed longer than expected. These observations did not yet form conclusions. They accumulated quietly, strengthening the feeling that something essential had been withdrawn. No one knew what to ask. Fear without explanation does not produce questions. It produces restraint. People chose not to speak, not to go outside, not to test the night for answers. Each waited for confirmation that never arrived. This fear did not spread quickly. It deepened. Hours passed without resolution. The city remained intact, functional, but inwardly unsettled. The fear had no outlet. It could not be directed at an enemy or event. It simply existed, eroding confidence in continuity. Some prayed. Others lay awake, counting the minutes until dawn. The expectation that morning would restore order remained, though it weakened with each passing hour. Fear pressed against that belief, testing it gently but persistently. Paris endured this state quietly. The city had learned long ago that fear was safest when kept private. To express it openly was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny required reasons that no one yet possessed. And so fear remained unnamed. It did not shout, It did not move. It waited, like the city itself, for something that would finally give it form. 14. Seals returning to the crown. Chetan before dawn, authority completed its circuit. Those who had carried out the orders returned quietly to the places from which they had come. Their movements were slower now, not from fatigue, but from finality. The work of the night no longer required precision of timing. It required closure. Seals were returned. Wax marks that had traveled outward through the city earlier now came back intact, bearing confirmation rather than instruction. The documents they had secured were gathered, aligned, and placed once more under the Crown's custody. Nothing was left loose. Nothing was allowed to remain in motion beyond its purpose. This return was silent. No ceremony accompanied it. No acknowledgement passed between those involved beyond the smallest gestures. A nod, the closing of a ledger, the extinguishing of a lamp. The authority that had moved invisibly through Paris now folded back into itself, leaving the city unchanged in appearance. The importance of this moment lay in its invisibility. Once the seals returned, the night ceased to be active. What followed would no longer be decision or action, but consequence. The mechanism that had removed the order disengaged without trace, as though it had never been present. Those who returned the seals did not linger. They understood that their role ended here. What came next would unfold publicly, governed by proclamation and memory rather than movement. Their task had been to ensure that the transition from one state to another occurred without interruption. In chambers near the heart of power, documents were stored away. The seals remained unbroken on some, as though to preserve the illusion that nothing irreversible had yet occurred. On others, the wax bore the marks of having been opened and closed again, their surfaces dulled by handling. These differences mattered only to those who would later reconstruct the sequence of events. Paris would never see these seals. It would never witness their return. The city would feel only the effects of what they had authorized, not the moment when authority confirmed itself complete. This quiet conclusion ensured that no correction was possible. By the time dawn approached, there were no orders left in circulation, no instructions awaiting execution. The night had done everything it intended to do. The machinery of power stood still again, its movement concealed within the stillness it had created. Paris waited without knowing why. The seals had returned, and with them, the last opportunity for the night to be interrupted passed unnoticed. 15. Waiting for the first bell. The city waited. Not consciously, not with intention, but with the quiet expectation that had always accompanied the final hours of night. Dawn approached in measured increments, light gathering slowly beyond the walls, unseen but anticipated. Paris had learned to trust this passage. Night ended. Day followed. Whatever discomfort lingered would dissolve with the morning. The bells had not yet rung. That absence held weight. In the hours before dawn, bells served as transition rather than command. They marked the boundary between what belonged to night and what could be addressed by day. Until they sounded, nothing was required of anyone. Action could still be postponed. Responsibility could still be deferred. People remained inside. Those who lay awake listened for the first indication that time had resumed its ordinary authority. The sound of bells would release them from uncertainty, allowing unease to be reinterpreted as restlessness, fear as fatigue. Until then, the night retained its hold. The streets remained empty. No early movement broke the stillness. Bakers had not yet opened their doors. Watchmen moved only as required, their steps slow, unhurried. Even the air seemed suspended, waiting for permission to change. In the quarters where the commanderies stood dark, the waiting was sharper. Those nearby sensed that the morning would reveal something altered, though they could not yet imagine its form. The expectation settled heavily, replacing fear with inevitability. Whatever had happened, they understood now, would not be undone by daylight. The sky lightened imperceptibly. Shadows softened. The outline of rooftops became clearer against the thinning dark. Still, the bells did not ring. The delay felt deliberate, though no one could say by whom. Time stretched, emphasizing the space between anticipation and revelation. Paris held itself still. The city did not rush toward the morning. It waited for permission to begin again, trusting that the sound which had always guided it would do so once more. When the bells finally came, they would not announce catastrophe. They would not explain. They would only mark the hour. And in doing so, they would signal that the night, whatever it had concealed, was complete. Part 4. The Morning That Cannot Be Undone. Eula 16. Paris Learns. Paris learned slowly. There was no single announcement that delivered the truth in full. No proclamation gathered the city at once and named what had occurred during the night. Knowledge arrived in fragments, carried by ordinary morning movements that now felt slightly misaligned. Shutters opened. People stepped into the streets expecting familiarity and found instead a subtle absence. The city looked as it always had. Yet something essential was no longer where it should have been. Doors remained closed beyond their usual hour. Courtyards that normally stirred early showed no sign of life. At first, this was dismissed. Morning often unfolds unevenly. Some houses wake later than others. Some routines shift without explanation. Paris had learned not to question every deviation. Habit encouraged patience. Then names were spoken, not loudly, not publicly. A neighbor asked another whether he had seen the brothers that morning. A merchant remarked on a silence where there had always been movement. A baker noticed that a regular account would not be settled and wondered aloud why. The answers did not come immediately. Instead, questions accumulated. People returned from errands with incomplete information that someone had been taken, that a house had been emptied, that an official seal had been seen where none had been before. Each detail contradicted the assumption that the night had passed without consequence. The city began to align these fragments. What had been sensed before dawn now acquired shape. The unease of the night resolved into recognition. Something had happened not to an individual, but to a group. Not to a house, but to a structure embedded deeply within the city's life. Paris learned that the Templars had been arrested. The statement moved through the streets carefully, as though unsure of its own weight. Some repeated it with disbelief. Others tested it against what they had already observed. Closed doors, darkened chapels, the absence of familiar figures. Confirmation followed quickly. Royal authority did not deny it. It did not need to. The silence of the commanderies spoke more clearly than any declaration. Where explanation was lacking, certainty formed anyway. The city reacted without uproar. There was no immediate protest, no gathering of crowds. Shock expressed itself quietly. People paused mid-task. Conversations stopped and did not resume in the same way. Paris absorbed the news inwardly, adjusting its understanding of the world rather than attempting to challenge it. This restraint did not mean acceptance. It meant comprehension lagged behind awareness. The implications of what had occurred were too large to grasp all at once. The city required time to understand not only what had happened, but what it would mean to live afterward. Paris learned, not as a body, but as thousands of individuals reaching the same conclusion separately. By the time the morning advanced, the knowledge had settled. The order that had stood openly the night before was gone from the streets, and the city, now fully awake, understood that the night had not merely passed, it had decided something that daylight could not reverse. 17. Templar becomes a dangerous word, since the word did not disappear at once. At first it was spoken as it always had been, out of habit rather than intent. People repeated it while recounting what they had heard, testing the shape of the news with familiar language. The name still carried the weight of years, of service rendered and debts owed, of presence accepted without question. Then it changed. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it moved quickly. The word began to pause conversations rather than advance them. It interrupted sentences. It caused speakers to lower their voices or glance toward doors and windows before continuing. Templar no longer described a role. It suggested risk. Those who spoke it did so cautiously, as though uncertain whether the sound itself might draw attention. The city learned within hours that language had acquired consequences. To name the order openly was to acknowledge proximity to something newly suspect. People adjusted. They substituted phrases. The brothers, those men. The ones who were taken. These indirect references allowed conversation to continue without committing anyone to a position. Ambiguity became a form of protection. In some places, the word vanished entirely. Merchants removed it from account books. Servants avoided it in conversation. Children were corrected when they used it aloud. The silence around the name spread faster than the news itself, reshaping speech before understanding had fully formed. This transformation did not require instruction. No decree forbade the word. No punishment was attached to its use. Fear accomplished the work more efficiently than law ever could. The city understood that names could now be counted among liabilities. Those who had once spoken proudly of association with the order revised their memories. Stories were retold with details omitted. Familiar interactions were reframed as distant or incidental. People learned quickly how to place themselves at the edges of what had become dangerous. The word Templar carried uncertainty. To speak it was to acknowledge a connection whose value had not yet been recalculated. Until the Crown clarified its intent, silence felt safer than loyalty, and distance more prudent than remembrance. Paris adapted its language as it always had. The city had survived many shifts in power by learning when to speak and when not to. This morning added another lesson to that tradition. Words like people could be taken, and once taken, they did not return unchanged. 18. Remembering debts. Memory became selective. As the morning progressed and the reality of the arrests settled into daily movement, people began to reconsider what they remembered and what they preferred not to. The presence of the Templars in Paris had never been abstract. It had been practical, financial, deeply entangled with ordinary lives. That entanglement now demanded reassessment. Debts surfaced quietly. They were not announced, not demanded, not recorded in any new way. They emerged instead in private thoughts, in ledgers reopened and closed again, in glances exchanged between partners who suddenly realized that obligations once assumed permanent had lost their certainty. Some owed money to the order. Loans taken years earlier, extended on trust rather than pressure, secured by reputation rather than force. These debts had been stable, predictable, their terms understood. Now they existed in a space without clear authority. With the brothers removed and their houses closed, responsibility seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. Others owed favors, protection offered during disputes, intercession in matters that required influence rather than law, assistance given quietly, without record. These obligations had never been written down, yet they carried weight. That weight now felt dangerous. People asked themselves whether these connections still existed, and if they did, whether acknowledging them would bring consequence rather than relief. Some chose silence. They closed books without adjusting figures. They postponed payments without explanation. They told themselves that resolution would come later, once the situation clarified. Delay became a shield, justified by confusion rather than intent. Others acted quickly. They erased names from records. They destroyed correspondence. They denied recollections that might implicate them in association with the fallen order. Prudence replaced loyalty without ceremony. This recalibration did not require coordination. It happened simultaneously, guided by instinct rather than instruction. Each person responded to the same pressure in isolation, arriving at similar conclusions through private reasoning. Paris did not erupt into conflict over these debts. There were no public disputes, no confrontations demanding settlement. The uncertainty itself prevented action. Without a recognized authority to receive payment or enforce obligation, inaction felt safer than resolution. Debt, once a bond, became a liability. To remember too clearly was to risk association. To forget too thoroughly was to invite future accusation. People learned to navigate this tension carefully, balancing conscience against survival. The city adjusted its moral accounting. What had once been honorable to acknowledge became dangerous to admit. What had once been stable became provisional. Paris learned that memory, like language, could become a threat. And so debts were remembered quietly, held without voice, waiting for a future that would determine whether they still mattered at all. 19. Closed churches and empty houses. The city marked absence by what did not open. Churches that had once welcomed early prayers remained closed beyond the usual hour. Their doors, heavy and familiar, did not yield to hands that expected them to. Notices were absent. No explanations were offered. The silence of the entrances spoke on their behalf. People stopped, waited, then moved on. At first, they assumed delay. A late priest, an altered schedule. These were small inconveniences, easily forgiven. But as the morning advanced and more doors failed to open, delay lost its plausibility. Inside the commanderies, nothing stirred. Windows remained dark. Courtyards showed no sign of preparation. The ordinary signs of life, a servant crossing with water, a brother pausing at a doorway, did not appear. The buildings stood intact, yet emptied of purpose. This emptiness carried a different weight than darkness had during the night. Darkness could be sleep. It could be rest. Daylight, however, demanded explanation. When light revealed no movement where movement was expected, absence became undeniable. Neighbors noticed. They lingered longer than usual near the closed houses, not out of curiosity, but habit interrupted. Paths that once passed through these spaces now ended abruptly. The city's circulation adjusted, rerouting itself around voids that had not existed the day before. Inside homes, people counted what had vanished. Not only the brothers themselves, but the services they provided, the mediation they offered, the quiet authority they represented. Their removal created practical gaps that could not be filled immediately, if at all. Some churches opened later in the day. Others did not open at all. The inconsistency deepened confusion. Without clear instruction, people interpreted closures according to their own fears. Some saw punishment, others saw precaution. Few believed it was temporary. Empty houses drew more attention than closed churches. They stood as visible interruptions in the city's texture. Doors barred not for the night, but for an unknown duration. Spaces that had once anchored neighborhoods now offered no reassurance of return. Children asked questions. They were given none. Adults avoided explanations they could not yet shape. The absence of clear reason made even truthful answers feel dangerous. Paris adjusted again. People avoided these places. They crossed streets rather than pass by familiar gates now associated with uncertainty. What could not be entered became something to be kept at distance. The city learned through these closed doors and empty houses that the arrests had not been symbolic. They had practical consequence. Structures remained. Functions did not. And the gap between the two widened with each hour, reshaping the city's movement without altering its appearance. 20. An order that exists only on paper. By midday, the distinction became unavoidable. The order still existed. Its name appeared in documents. Its seals remained recognized by law. Its charters had not yet been revoked. On parchment and in record books, nothing had been erased. The structure persisted in ink, intact and unquestioned. In the city, it did not. The brothers were absent. The houses were closed. The routines that had given the order presence had been interrupted without replacement. What remained could not be encountered, consulted, or appealed to. It could only be referenced. This difference altered how people spoke of it. They began to use phrases that acknowledged distance rather than reality. According to the order, as it was written, as it once stood. The language shifted instinctively, marking the gap between formal existence and lived experience. Officials continued to record matters as though the order remained operational. Accounts were noted, properties were listed, obligations were copied forward. This adherence to form preserved the appearance of continuity, even as substance had already been removed. Paper carried authority where people no longer could. The city recognized the danger in this condition. An institution that exists only on paper cannot answer questions. It cannot correct misunderstandings. It cannot defend itself against reinterpretation. Its silence becomes an invitation for others to speak on its behalf. This vulnerability was immediate. Rumors began to attach themselves to the written order in ways they never had to the living one. Speculation filled the space left by absence. What could not be confirmed could not be denied. Those who had relied on the order felt this acutely. They searched for someone to consult, someone who could clarify whether obligations still held, where the protections still applied. No one presented themselves. The paper authority offered no guidance. Paris learned that legality without presence is fragile. The Order's continued existence in record did not reassure. It unsettled. It suggested that something unresolved lingered beneath the surface, waiting to be defined by forces no longer bound by the relationships that had once tempered power. By the end of the day, the city no longer treated the Order as a living entity. It treated it as a problem yet to be resolved, an entry awaiting conclusion. And everyone understood, without having to say it aloud, that whatever decision came next would not be made by the brothers who had once given the Order its voice. Yavasasta's Epilogue, The Night That Lasted Years. 21. Trials as an extension of the night. The night did not end with morning. It receded. But it did not release what it had begun. The arrests, completed in silence, extended themselves into daylight through a different mechanism, one that spoke informal language and claimed the authority of law, yet retained the same essential quality as the night itself. The trials began quietly. There was no dramatic summons, no public confrontation that would have marked a clear transition from secrecy to judgment. Instead, proceedings unfolded in controlled spaces, governed by procedure rather than visibility. What had been removed from the streets now reappeared only in rooms where sound did not travel far. The structure of these trials mirrored the structure of the arrests. Questions were precise. Answers were constrained. Time was regulated. The same emphasis on order replaced any expectation of exchange. Speech was permitted now, but within limits that preserved the imbalance established during the night. The brothers were allowed to speak, but only in ways that served the process rather than themselves. Confessions were requested not as discoveries, but as confirmations. The language of inquiry assumed conclusion. What was sought was not understanding, but alignment. Words shaped to fit decisions already set in place. This continuity mattered. The night had taught the city that power preferred quiet. The trials demonstrated that it preferred the same quiet even when acting in daylight. The absence of spectacle did not soften the outcome. It ensured that judgment progressed without interruption. Paris observed from a distance. Most people did not attend. They did not hear the questions or the answers. What reached them were summaries, fragments, official statements that translated complex proceedings into simple assertions. The lack of detail discouraged engagement. Those who listened closely noticed something familiar. The same silence that had defined the arrests persisted here, refined rather than removed. Information arrived filtered, shaped to avoid provoking response. The city was given just enough to accept what followed, and no more. In this way, the trials did not resolve the night. They prolonged it. They extended its logic into weeks, months, and years, transforming a single evening into a sustained condition. What had begun as an unseen operation became a drawn-out process that never fully emerged into the open. The city adapted. As days passed, the extraordinary became procedural. The trials blended into the background of governance, one matter among many. Attention shifted elsewhere, not because justice had been satisfied, but because endurance demanded it. The night continued, not in darkness, but in method. It persisted through repetition, through the slow normalization of what had once felt unthinkable. Paris learned that a night does not need to be remembered vividly to remain influential. It only needs to be extended. 22. Confessions no one heard. The confessions did not echo. They were spoken, recorded, translated into official language, and then contained. Their existence was acknowledged without being shared. What was said remained largely within the walls where it had been extracted, never fully entering the life of the city that had once known the speakers. The brothers were questioned repeatedly, not in search of truth as they understood it, but in pursuit of statements that could be shaped, aligned, and repeated. The questions followed patterns. They returned to the same themes, the same suspicions, the same formulations. Answers that deviated were revisited until they conformed or were discarded. Many spoke, some out of exhaustion, others out of hope that cooperation might restore order, that clarity might still protect them. A few remained silent, not as resistance, but as the last form of control available to them. The city heard almost nothing of this. What reached Paris were conclusions without context, words stripped of the conditions under which they had been given. Confessions summarized into claims that required no further explanation. The distance between utterance and reception widened until meaning could no longer travel intact. Those who might have listened were not invited to do so. Proceedings were not public in the way trials of consequence often are. There were no crowds, no sustained attention, no shared witnessing. The absence of audience ensured that the confessions could not complicate the narrative already forming. This absence was decisive. Without witnesses, a confession becomes a tool rather than a statement. It serves the structure that records it, not the voice that produces it. Whatever doubt may have accompanied the words at their origin did not survive their transmission. Some in the city suspected this. They spoke quietly, as they had learned to do. They questioned how such uniform conclusions could emerge from so many individuals. They wondered why explanations remained vague, even as accusations hardened. These doubts did not organize. They dissolved into private unease. The confessions did not change the city's course. They justified it. Each recorded statement reinforced the logic of the night that had begun everything. Silence had removed the order. Controlled speech now ensured it would not return in any form that challenged the authority which had taken it. For the brothers, the experience was isolating. They spoke without knowing who would hear them, or how their words would be used. Speech, once denied entirely, now felt equally ineffective. Whether spoken or withheld, it no longer altered outcome. For Paris, the confessions became abstractions. They existed as proof without presence, as evidence without encounter. The city accepted them not because it understood them, but because it had been conditioned to accept conclusions delivered without explanation. Thus, the confessions passed through the city unheard, not because they were silent, but because there was no place left where hearing them mattered. E23. Slow erasure. And the disappearance did not announce itself. It unfolded gradually, so slowly that it rarely drew attention to its own progress. Nothing was torn down in haste. No symbols were destroyed in public. The order faded not through spectacle, but through neglect carefully directed. Names were removed quietly, not all at once, and not everywhere. In some records they remained, copied forward out of habit. In others they were replaced with neutral phrasing, their absence disguised by administrative language. Over time, what had once been precise became vague, then optional, then forgotten. Properties changed hands without ceremony. Stewards were reassigned, revenues redirected. Lands once administered by the order were folded into other jurisdictions, their origins acknowledged only in footnotes that fewer and fewer people could read. The physical structures remained, but their purpose dissolved. The city adapted to these changes easily. Paris was accustomed to evolution disguised as continuity. When institutions altered shape slowly enough, the city absorbed them without resistance. Streets adjusted. Responsibilities shifted. What had once required explanation became background. Stories changed. Where the order had once been described as disciplined and dependable, it now appeared in recollections as distant, strange, excessive. Details softened. Memories contradicted one another. The certainty that had once surrounded its role blurred into ambiguity. This erosion was not accidental. Erasure works best when it appears organic, when no single hand can be identified as responsible. Resistance loses direction. People cannot protest what seems to dissolve on its own. The brothers became difficult to place in conversation. They belonged neither fully to the past nor to the present. They occupied a space between, referenced occasionally but never clearly. Their absence became normalized, then unremarkable. Children grew up without seeing them. They learned of the order as something that had once existed, but not something that might return. What cannot be encountered cannot be imagined as current. With each passing year, the possibility of restoration diminished. Documents survived longer than memory, but even these required interpretation. Without living representatives to assert meaning, the written record became pliable. What had been stated plainly could now be reframed, questioned, or ignored. Paris moved on, not because it had resolved what had happened, but because the structure of daily life demanded it. Erasure does not require agreement. It requires only time and the absence of interruption. By the time the order's name appeared rarely and without clarity, the work was complete. Nothing dramatic marked its end. It simply ceased to matter. 24. The Last Grand Master. He remained as a figure after the structure had vanished. While the order dissolved into documents and memory, the last Grand Master endured as a living remainder of what had been removed. His existence complicated the narrative. As long as he lived, the night could not fully conclude. He was held apart, not placed among the crowds, not allowed to disappear into anonymity. His confinement was deliberate, measured, designed to preserve him as a symbol rather than a man. Where others were absorbed into obscurity, he was kept visible enough to be remembered, yet distant enough to be unheard. Time passed unevenly for him. Days followed one another without distinction. Seasons changed beyond walls he could not see. Information reached him filtered and late, stripped of urgency. The world continued elsewhere, but his position remained fixed, suspended between relevance and erasure. The city spoke of him rarely. When it did, his name carried uncertainty. Some remembered his authority. Others recalled only accusations attached to it. Few spoke with confidence. The ambiguity served power better than clarity ever could. He was asked to recant, not once, but repeatedly. The request was framed as resolution, as an opportunity to bring the long process to rest. Acceptance would simplify matters. Refusal would extend them. The choice presented itself as personal, though its consequences were carefully arranged. He did not yield easily. His resistance was not dramatic. It did not seek attention. It took the form of consistency, a refusal to reshape his words to fit conclusions already drawn. This steadiness frustrated a process that relied on compliance rather than debate. Years passed. What had once been urgent became routine. Interest diminished. The city learned to place the Grand Master in the category of unresolved matters, acknowledged but not actively considered. His continued existence no longer threatened stability. It merely delayed finality. When the end came, it was not unexpected. There was no reversal, no moment of recognition that altered the course already taken. His death closed a chapter that had been winding down for years, long after most had stopped reading. The city did not change that day. There were no gatherings, no sudden reckoning. The absence he had embodied for so long simply deepened. What little remained of the Order's living presence dissolved with him. With the last Grand Master gone, the night lost its final witness. What followed belonged entirely to history, shaped by those who would speak of it without having lived within it. 25. A night that never truly ended. The night did not remain in memory as a single event. It dispersed. What had begun in darkness and silence extended itself into structures, habits, and assumptions that outlived all who had taken part in it. The night ceased to belong to a date or an hour. It became a method, a way in which power learned it could act without resistance. Paris remembered fragments. It remembered closed doors, the absence of familiar figures, words that had grown dangerous to speak. But memory did not preserve sequence. Without sequence, understanding weakened. The city retained impressions rather than conclusions. History inherited what the city could not resolve. Chroniclers recorded outcomes more readily than processes. They named charges, dates, verdicts. They struggled to capture the quiet efficiency with which an entire order had been removed before it could be seen resisting. Silence does not translate easily into record. What endured was precedent. The night demonstrated that transformation need not announce itself, that institutions could be undone without confrontation, that fear, when left undefined, could regulate behavior more effectively than force. Those lessons were not forgotten. They passed forward through governance, through law, through the careful management of information. The night became a reference point rarely named, but often invoked through imitation. For the city, life continued. New rhythms formed. New authorities filled the spaces left behind. Children grew into adults without knowing the streets as they had once been. What had vanished became part of the city's unseen foundation, no longer visible, but still shaping movement above it. The order remained in stories, sometimes as caution, sometimes as myth, sometimes as abstraction. Its fate was argued, interpreted, repurposed according to the needs of those who spoke of it. Distance made certainty impossible. The night itself resisted closure. It offered no single moment of ending, no sound that marked its departure. It simply receded into time, leaving behind patterns that would repeat under different names and circumstances. And so, the night never truly ended. It learned how to persist,